"Arrest them," the Baron commanded his deputy. The lawman drew his gun, but in a stunning twist, he aimed it straight at the Baron's heart. A widow, pregnant with the secret of her murdered husband. A giant cowboy, haunted by a failure he could never forgive. They were two strangers in a town suffocated by the iron fist of a corrupt baron. When a cruel decree cast her out into the cold, a silent vow was made. This is the story of a showdown for justice, where the courage of two lone souls would ignite a fire that would change a town forever. Havenwood was a town held captive by two things: the endless shadow-casting pines of Oregon and the will of Jedediah Thorne. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and sawdust, clung to everything, a constant reminder of the lumber mill that was both the town's lifeblood and its leash. Yet inside the cold shell of a disused warehouse, Eleanor Vance cultivated a small, stubborn patch of warmth. Here, surrounded by donated dog-eared books, she was not a widow shadowed by tragedy, but simply Ellie, the storyteller. The faces of the half-dozen children gathered on a worn rug glowed in the light of a single kerosene lamp. Their world shrunk to the sound of her voice. She was telling them a story of a lost star finding its way home, and for a precious hour the grim reality of Havenwood, a town where fathers went to the mill with fear in their eyes, ceased to exist. This was Michael's dream before it was hers. He had believed a library could be a town's conscience, a place where truth, like a stubborn root, could break through the hardest ground. Michael, her brilliant, fearless journalist husband who had asked too many questions about Thorne's logging operations and had been silenced by a conveniently fatal accident 6 months ago. Her hand drifted from the book to rest on the gentle swell of her belly, a secret she held as tightly as her grief. A sudden soft flutter from within sent a jolt of fierce protective love through her, a tiny, insistent kick. It was a promise of a future Michael would never see, a life she had to shield from the man who had likely taken his. Her fingers found the cool, familiar silver of the locket he had given her, its surface worn smooth by the constant touch of her thumb. Inside was his smiling face, forever young, forever brave. It was her armor, her last link to a life where hope had been easy. As she finished the story and the children's cheerful goodbyes faded into the misty twilight, Ellie felt a moment of quiet contentment. She turned to stack the books, her back to the large grimy window that faced the town's main street. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a large, dark shape passing by, momentarily blocking the light from the street lamp. She didn't need to see the face to know who it was. The shadow of Jedediah Thorne was long, and it touched everything in this town. The small, hopeful smile on Ellie's lips vanished, extinguished as quickly as a candle in the wind. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was always watching. The next morning, a hard, merciless cold had settled over Havenwood. Jedediah Thorne had called a town meeting, and when Thorne called, the town answered. They gathered in the town hall, a place where his will was given the thin varnish of civic process. Thorne stood before them, not a titan of industry, but a concerned patriarch, his voice a low, reasonable rumble that did nothing to hide the granite underneath. He spoke of Havenwood's character, of decency, of protecting their families from unwelcome influences that cast a shadow on their good name. He never mentioned Eleanor Vance by name, but every eye, heavy with a mixture of pity and fear, turned to where she sat alone in the back row. "A town is judged by the standards it keeps," Thorne said, his gaze finally settling on her, cold and heavy as a tombstone. "We cannot allow a flagrant disregard for moral propriety to take root here. Therefore, the plot of land set aside for public use will be repurposed, and we will ensure our community is not burdened by those who live outside the bounds of respectable conduct." The verdict was delivered. There was no vote, only a thick, suffocating silence. Ellie looked across the sea of familiar faces, the blacksmith, the store owner, the wives she'd exchanged pleasantries with, and found no one willing to meet her eyes. The order fell to Deputy Miller, a man whose shoulders had been stooped for years by the weight of a compromised badge. He met her at the door of her small cottage, the one Michael had built with his own hands, his face a mask of weary resignation. "I'm sorry, Ellie," he mumbled, refusing to look at her belly. "I have my orders." She offered no pleas, no tears. That was what Thorne wanted. Instead, she moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, packing a single, small suitcase. She took Michael's photograph from the mantel, the locket from her neck, and the small, locked box of his research notes from its hiding place beneath the floorboards. Everything else was just wood and fabric. Deputy Miller held the door open as she stepped out onto the porch. The first flakes of a heavy snow were beginning to fall, ghost-like in the grey afternoon light. She did not look back as the door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing the final closing of a chapter in her life. With one hand clutching the handle of her suitcase and the other protectively cradling her unborn child, Ellie was left alone to face the biting wind and the encroaching darkness, a solitary, desperate figure in a town that had just declared her an outcast. Silas Blackwood had seen this brand of quiet cruelty in a dozen towns from the Rio Grande to the Rockies. The smart thing, the thing that had kept him alive, was to turn away. He'd already paid for his room at the boarding house and his horse was ready. By sunrise, Havenwood and its troubles would be nothing but a cold memory. He stood in the shadows of the livery, a giant of a man whose stillness was more intimidating than any movement, and watched as the town swallowed Eleanor Vance whole. Doors closed, curtains were drawn. It was as if she had been erased. He saw her shiver, a tremor that shook her entire small frame, and the ghosts of his past rose up, refusing to be ignored. He moved without making a conscious decision, his long legs eating up the distance across the snow-dusted street. He didn't say a word as he reached her, his sheer size blocking the biting wind. He shrugged off his own heavy sheepskin coat, a worn, battered thing that smelled of wood smoke and leather, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The weight and warmth of it enveloped her, a sudden, startling shield against the world's coldness. He then uncorked a small metal flask from his belt, the steam of black coffee rising into the frigid air, and pressed it into her hands. "Here," was all he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. Ellie looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. In this town, kindness from a stranger was a currency she'd never seen. As her numb fingers fumbled to grip the flask, the delicate silver chain around her neck snagged on the thick collar of the coat. The locket, her one precious anchor, slipped free and fell with a soft thud into the fresh snow at his feet. Before she could bend to retrieve it, his large hand had already scooped it up. He held it in his palm for a moment, the worn silver looking impossibly small and fragile against his calloused skin. It was still warm from her body. He looked from the locket to her pale, resolute face, and something shifted deep within his eyes. The drifter, the man who never stayed, had just found his reason to stop. He placed the locket gently back into her hand, his expression now hard and unreadable as stone. He was not leaving. The boarding house room was 4 walls and a bed, a place to rest a body, not a soul. It was anonymous, just like the dozen rooms Silas had occupied in the last year. He'd found a room for Ellie in the same establishment down the hall after its owner, a stern widow who disliked Thorne more than she feared him, had reluctantly agreed. Now, in the solitary quiet, Silas sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the silver locket resting in the center of his palm. He had meant to return it to her, but he hadn't wanted to disturb her. Looking at it now, the object seemed to burn with a cold fire, searing a hole straight through the present and into a past he had crossed 3 states to outrun. He wasn't in Havenwood anymore. He was back in the Texas Panhandle, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The air there hadn't smelled of pine, but of smoke and failure. He remembered the homesteader, a good man named Abel, and his wife, who had a laugh like wind chimes. And he remembered their daughter Maria, a solemn child with eyes as dark as well water, who had shyly offered him a freshly picked wildflower. Silas, a Texas Ranger then, had given them his word. He'd promised to handle the land baron who was trying to drive them out. He'd told them he would be back before the week was out. He was 2 days late. The memory was not a story, but a series of sharp, jagged images. The unnatural silence of the homestead, the black skeletal frame of the burned-out cabin, the scent of ash that clung to the back of his throat. He had looked for them, his heart a cold, heavy knot in his chest. He found what was left of Maria in the cinders. Not the girl, but her doll, a small thing of stitched-together flour sacks, its button eyes staring up at a smoky sky that had offered no salvation. He had carried that failure with him ever since, a weight far heavier than the ranger's badge he'd left on his captain's desk. He closed his hand, the sharp edges of the locket digging into his skin, grounding him back in the chilly Oregon room. In Eleanor Vance, he saw the homesteader's wife. In the unborn child she carried, he saw the ghost of a little girl with a wildflower. He was being offered a second chance he knew he didn't deserve. He rose and walked to the grimy window, looking out at the silent, snow-covered street below. He wasn't just fighting for a wronged woman anymore. He was fighting the ghost of the man he'd been, the one who had been too late. And his own voice, low and rough with disuse, filled the small room, a vow spoken to the shadows. "This time, Maria," he whispered, "it'll be different." Jedediah Thorne was not a man who left loose ends. To cement his victory and put the final nail in the coffin of Ellie's dream, he announced a public auction for the newly available plot of land. It was a piece of theater meant to demonstrate his absolute power, held on the steps of the town hall for all to see. Ellie was there, standing near the back of the small crowd, her face pale, but her spine straight. She had to bear witness. At her side, Silas stood like an ancient pine, his sheer presence a silent declaration that she was not alone. The townspeople watched, their faces impassive, their silence a familiar blend of fear and shame. Thorne's lawyer, a man named Fincher with a rat-like face and an oily smile, conducted the proceedings. The bidding was a farce, a few of Thorne's cronies making token offers before Thorne himself placed a final, insurmountable bid. "Going once," Fincher called out, his voice slick with false ceremony. "Going twice." "I have a point of order," Silas's voice cut through the air, calm and clear as a river stone. Every head turned. He stepped forward, not with a wallet, but with a rolled-up document in his hand. "I spent last night at the county records office. This is a certified copy of the original Havenwood Town Charter, signed in 1878. He unrolled the brittle paper. "I'd like to draw the Assembly's attention to Section 4, Paragraph 2. Fincher scoffed. "This is an auction, not a history lesson." Silas ignored him, his eyes fixed on the crowd as he read. "The plot designated herein as the public square shall be held in perpetual trust for the education and edification of the citizenry." He let the words hang in the cold air. Perpetual trust. "That means it can't be bought or sold. Not by you," he nodded at Thorne. "Not by anyone. It belongs to the people of Havenwood." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not complex law. It was a simple, powerful truth. Fincher began to sputter about bylaws and amendments, but Silas held his ground, his calm certainty a rock against which the lawyer's frantic words broke and dissolved. Thorne, trapped by the very laws he had used to build his empire, was forced to concede. His face was a thundercloud of fury as the auction was declared null and void. The crowd dispersed quickly, not wanting to be near the coming storm. As Ellie and Silas turned to leave, Thorne blocked their path, his veneer of the town father stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. He got close to Silas, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You've made a powerful enemy, stranger." He glanced at Ellie, a look of pure malice in his eyes. "You'll both pay for this." The war was no longer one of shadows. It was now declared in the open street for all to see. The victory at the town hall was a small, bright flame in the oppressive gloom of Havenwood. For the first time in months, Ellie felt a surge of something other than grief or fear. It felt like a fighting chance. She had to share it with the one person in town she still considered a friend. Clara, the storekeeper's wife. She found her in the back storeroom of the Mercantile, surrounded by the comforting scents of cinnamon, coffee, and dry goods. But the moment Clara turned, the hopeful words died on Ellie's lips. Clara's face was a mess of tear-streaked misery, her eyes wide with a guilt that was impossible to mistake. "I heard what happened," Clara whispered, wringing a linen apron in her hands. "The whole town is talking about it." "We won, Clara," Ellie said softly. He couldn't take the land. A fresh wave of tears welled in Clara's eyes, and a terrible broken sob escaped her. "Oh, Ellie, I'm so sorry," she finally confessed, the words tumbling out in a rushed, shameful torrent. "It was me. I was the one who told Thorne you might still have Michael's journal. He came to the store. He knew about the loan we took out for the business. He owns the bank, Ellie. He is the bank. He said he would ruin us, that he'd see my husband and me out on the street with nothing." She couldn't look at Ellie, her gaze fixed on the dusty floorboards as if they held the weight of her shame. The small flame of hope inside Ellie sputtered and died, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. The victory at the auction felt like a child's game in the face of this. Silas could fight a man's laws, but how could they fight the fear that had poisoned the very soul of this town, turning friends into unwilling instruments of evil? She felt no anger toward Clara, only a profound, bone-deep sorrow for them both. She had thought Thorne was her only enemy, but now she understood his true power lay in the way he could make good people betray everything they believed in. Clara frantically began filling a small basket with bread, cheese, and a jar of preserves, her hands shaking. "You have to be careful," she pleaded, pushing the basket into Ellie's hands. "This victory, it will only make him angrier. He won't be beaten by laws and papers. He won't stop at this." The warning was not a guess. It was a desperate plea from someone who had seen the true, unforgiving face of Jedediah Thorne's rage. It was a promise of the violence to come. Sleep did not come to Ellie that night. Clara's warning echoed in the oppressive silence of her small room, a premonition of violence that made every creak of the old boarding house sound like a threat. Down the hall, Silas was also awake. He sat in a chair facing the door, fully dressed, his senses honed by years of sleeping in hostile territory. He did not know what form Thorne's retribution would take, only that it would come. It began not with a bang, but with the sharp, distinct shatter of glass from downstairs, followed an instant later by a hungry, whooshing roar that was unmistakable fire. Before the first screams from the other boarders had even started, Silas was at Ellie's door, splintering the lock with a single, powerful kick. Smoke was already coiling under the door, thick and acrid. "Stay low! Follow me," he commanded, his voice cutting through the growing panic. He pulled a wet cloth from her wash basin, pressed it into her hand, and guided her into the churning, smoke-filled hallway. They were halfway down the main staircase, the heat growing more intense with every step, when Ellie stopped, her face a mask of horror. "The box!" she cried, her voice cracking. "Michael's work." "It's still in my room." For a single, heartbeat-long moment, their eyes met through the swirling haze. He saw the legacy she was trying to protect. She saw the promise he was determined to keep. Without a word, he shoved her toward the front door and the relative safety of the street. "Go," he yelled, and then he turned, disappearing back into the inferno. He emerged moments later, a ghost-like figure wreathed in smoke and embers, the precious metal box clutched under one arm. They had reached the threshold of the front door, the cold night air a promise of survival just inches away, when a sound like a gunshot cracked from the ceiling above. A massive burning rafter, its support eaten away by the flames, broke free and came plummeting down directly toward them. It was a death sentence falling from the sky. Silas's reaction was pure instinct. He threw Ellie forward, out of the doorway and into the snow, while simultaneously twisting to take the full, crushing impact of the beam across his own broad back and shoulders. He roared in pain as the burning wood struck, shielding her from the blast of heat and splintering timber with his own body. Outside, amidst the orange glow and rising chaos, Ellie rushed to his side. Ignoring the gawking townspeople, she ripped a long strip of cloth from the hem of her petticoat, packed it with clean snow, and gently pressed the makeshift compress against the raw, angry burn on his back. He grunted, a low sound of agony, but did not pull away. In that silent, desperate moment, surrounded by the ruins of their sanctuary, a bond was forged between them, sealed by sacrifice and fire. The morning after the fire was colder than the night before. The charred skeleton of the boarding house stood as a stark, smoking warning to the entire town. Ellie and Silas sat on a bench outside the mercantile, homeless, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the metal box at their feet. Silas bore the pain from his burns with a stoic silence, his back held unnaturally straight. The town flowed around them like a river around a stone, the people of Havenwood hurrying past, their gazes fixed on the ground, their faces tight with a fear that was stronger than any sense of neighborly duty. The isolation was absolute, a wall of silence built brick by brick with every averted glance. Then a small figure broke free from the current. It was young Timmy, one of the boys who had listened so intently to Ellie's stories. His mother hissed his name from a doorway, her hand outstretched, her face pale with terror, but the boy ignored her. He marched with the solemn purpose only a child can possess, right up to the bench. He stopped before Ellie, his small face a picture of earnest concern. "This is for you, Miss Ellie," he said, his voice a clear pipe in the heavy silence. He held out his hand, offering up his most prized possession, a single, slightly sticky piece of peppermint candy. "'Cause you're sad." The simple, profound innocence of the act was like a physical blow. Ellie felt tears she hadn't known were there sting her eyes. She accepted the candy as if it were a precious jewel. Across the street, several townspeople who had witnessed the exchange stopped, their feigned indifference broken. A flicker of shame crossed their faces. Timmy's mother, seeing the act was done, simply nodded, a silent surrender of fear to a son's decency. Later, inspired by the boy's courage, Clara slipped out of the mercantile and quietly left a small parcel on the bench, clean bandages and a jar of burn salve. From the far end of the street, Deputy Miller watched the entire scene, his hand resting on his gun belt, his expression unreadable but for the deep conflict in his eyes. But the moment of grace was shattered by the approach of one of Thorne's lumberjacks, a brutish man with a sneer who had seen the boy's defiance. He started toward Timmy, intending to make an example of him. "Well now, what's this?" he began, his voice dripping with menace. Before he could take another step, Silas moved. He didn't speak. He didn't make a threat. He simply rose to his full, towering height, planting himself between the bully and the child. The sheer, immovable mass of him was a statement more powerful than any weapon. The henchman froze, his eyes traveling up the mountain of a man before him. He saw the cold promise in Silas's gaze, faltered, and then sullenly turned and walked away, defeated by a silence more profound than his own hate. Deputy Miller did not sleep that night. He sat in his small, dark office, the tin star on his chest feeling heavier than it ever had before. Through his window, he could see the livery stable where the whole town knew the outcasts had taken shelter. The image of the little boy, Timmy, standing defiant with a piece of candy, was burned into his mind. He remembered Michael Vance, too. Remembered him as a decent man who asked honest questions. And he remembered the day of the accident at the mill, the official report he had filed, every word a lie dictated by Jedediah Thorne. For months, Miller had told himself he was just a man with a family to feed, a man who knew which way the wind blew in Havenwood. But the wind had changed. It now carried the scent of smoke and the sting of his own cowardice. He moved through the sleeping town like a ghost, his boots making no sound on the packed dirt. He found Silas in the livery, awake and on watch, sitting on a hay bale in the deep shadows. The two men regarded each other for a long moment, the air thick with unspoken understanding. There was no need for introductions or pleasantries. "I can't be seen here," Miller said, his voice a low, strained whisper. "I can't testify. He'd destroy my family." He looked at Silas, his eyes pleading for comprehension. "But I can't live with what I've done, or with what I haven't done." He took a shaky breath, the confession tumbling out of him as if it had been poisoned. "Thorn keeps a private ledger. Everything is in it. The land grabs, the extortion, the real numbers from the mill. It's the proof you need." Silas remained perfectly still, his gaze never leaving the deputy's face. He didn't ask the question. He waited. "It's in a safe in his office," Miller continued, the words coming faster now. "Hidden behind the portrait of his late wife. He thinks he's clever." The deputy's mouth twisted into a bitter sneer. "The combination is her birthday, August 14th. 8:14. Having delivered his treason, a weight seemed to lift from Miller's shoulders, only to be replaced by a new, more immediate terror. "I was never here," he said, already backing away into the darkness. "I never told you anything." He turned and vanished, leaving Silas alone in the quiet company of the horses. The information settled in the air, heavy and dangerous. It was the key to unlocking every rotten secret in Havenwood, a key that could either liberate the town or get them both killed. While Silas moved like a shadow in the night, studying the routines around Thorn's office and planning his dangerous gambit, Ellie chose to fight in the light of day. She knew that even if Silas succeeded, a stolen ledger meant nothing if the hearts of the people remained locked in fear. She took her stand in the one place no one could ignore, the center of the town square. With no stage and no announcement, she simply began to speak, her voice, trained to fill concert halls, now clear and steady in the crisp morning air. At first, only the children dared to gather, but soon their mothers and fathers lingered, and then others, drawn by a courage they themselves did not yet possess. She was not making a speech. She was doing the one thing she did best. She was telling a story. "There was once a great forest," she began, "that lived in the shadow of a great grizzly bear. The bear was old and powerful, and he claimed all the best berry bushes for himself and every salmon in the stream. The other animals, the squirrels and the rabbits and the foxes, lived on whatever scraps he left behind, their hearts full of a quiet, gnawing fear." The townspeople listened, their faces still, every man and woman understanding that she was not speaking of animals. She told of how the animals forgot what it was like to be brave, until a wise old owl, before he disappeared, reminded them of a simple truth: the forest belonged to them all. Her story built a quiet crescendo of hope against a backdrop of fear. She spoke of a single brave rabbit who finally spoke up, not with a roar, but with a question. Why? As her tale reached its peak, two of Thorn's lumberjacks strode into the square, their expressions menacing, their intent to break up the gathering clear. A year ago, a week ago, the crowd would have melted away instantly. But today, something was different. The blacksmith, a man with arms as thick as oak limbs, did not move. The storekeeper, Clara's husband, stood his ground. A few other loggers, their faces grim, held their positions. They did not challenge Thorn's men. They simply stayed. They kept their eyes on Ellie, listening. Seeing their silent defiance, Ellie's voice swelled with a newfound power. She looked past the henchmen, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the people of Havenwood, her people. "The rabbit's question was a spark," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. And soon, the squirrels and the foxes and all the other animals began to ask it too. They looked at the great bear, and then they looked at each other. She paused, letting the silence stretch. "And they realized," she finished, her voice dropping to a powerful, resonant tone, "that when they stood together, they were bigger than the bear. A change had taken place. It was not yet a rebellion, but it was no longer submission. The fear in their eyes was being replaced by a dangerous, unfamiliar light. The time for stories was over. That night, as a sliver of moon offered little light and no comfort, Silas moved. The town of Havenwood slept a restless sleep, unaware that a ghost from the law's past was slipping through its shadows. Thorne's office was in the back of the lumber mill's main building, a place that reeked of power and sawdust. Silas moved with a deadly economy of motion, a shadow flowing through other shadows, his years as a ranger turning the act of infiltration into a grim, familiar dance. The lock on the door barely made a sound. Inside the office was a shrine to Thorne's ego, but Silas's eyes were drawn to the single portrait on the wall, a severe-looking woman with sad eyes. His wife. Back in the cold livery stable, Ellie could not rest. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every hoot of a distant owl sounded like a warning. She paced the small, hay-strewn space, her hand clutching the silver locket around her neck, her thumb rubbing the worn surface again and again. It was the only piece of Michael she had left, a tangible anchor in a sea of fear. She prayed for Silas's safety, for a future for her child, for a justice that seemed impossibly distant. As she turned, her foot caught on an uneven patch of ground. She stumbled, and the delicate silver chain, weakened by years of constant wear, finally snapped. The locket flew from her grasp, hitting a loose cobblestone with a sharp crack. At that same moment, Silas's calloused fingers turned the dial on the safe behind the portrait. 8:14. The heavy door swung open with a well-oiled whisper. Inside, nestled amongst stacks of cash and property deeds, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. He pulled it free, its weight a solid, satisfying confirmation of Miller's truth. His mission was complete. As Silas slipped back into the shadows of the stable, silent as the night itself, he found Ellie on her knees. She was not praying. She was staring at the broken locket in her hands. The impact had sprung a hidden seam, revealing a tiny, false back. Tucked inside was a minuscule piece of paper, folded so tightly it was no bigger than a grain of rice. With trembling fingers, she had worked it open. Silas placed the heavy ledger on an old crate, the sound causing her to look up, her eyes wide with a wild, disbelieving light. "Silas," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. She held out the tiny scrap of paper. He took it and read the faint pencil scrawl, Michael's last words from beyond the grave. "If you are reading this, Thorne is responsible." The only other man who saw was Deputy H. Miller. He signed the false report. "Forgive him. M.V." Silas looked from the note, proof of a murder, to the ledger, proof of the motive. They had it. They had everything, except the one thing they needed most, the courage of a compromised lawman. The bell in the town's small church had not been rung for a public summons in years, but Silas made it sing. Its urgent, clanging peal was a sound of alarm, of change, a sound that pulled the people of Havenwood from their homes and workshops, their faces a mixture of apprehension and a new, fragile curiosity. They gathered once more in the town hall, but the air was different this time. It was not thick with submission, but thin and electric with suspense. Ellie and Silas stood at the front, the heavy ledger placed on the podium between them like a Bible. Thorne arrived last, his lawyer at his side, his expression one of pure, condescending fury. He intended to crush this little rebellion once and for all. "My husband, Michael Vance, did not die in an accident," Ellie began, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the packed room. "He was murdered because he discovered the truth about the man who controls this town." She paused, her gaze sweeping over her neighbors. "The truth of how he has been bleeding you all dry for years." Silas opened the ledger. His voice was a low, steady rumble as he began to read. "Abel Potter, blacksmith. Loan of $500, interest rate falsified, deed to his smithy signed over as collateral under duress." He turned a page. "Henry Gable, farmer. Water rights to his creek illegally diverted to Thorne lumber property." He went on, name after name, crime after crime, weaving a story of systematic greed that had touched nearly every person in the room. Thorne began to laugh, a harsh, ugly sound, a compelling performance, a fairy tale from a troubled woman and a book of lies from a drifter and a thief. He fixed his imperious gaze on the lawman at the side of the room. "Deputy Miller," he commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "I've had enough of this circus. Arrest these two criminals." Every sound in the hall ceased. Every eye turned to the stoop-shouldered deputy. This was the moment. The town and Miller's own soul held its breath. Miller's hand went to his holster. The snap of the leather strap was like a gunshot in the silence. He drew his Colt revolver, the movement slow, deliberate, heavy with the weight of years of compromise. Thorne smiled, a victor's smirk. But the gun did not point at Silas. It swiveled, the dark, unblinking eye of the barrel coming to rest directly between Jedediah Thorne's eyes. Jedediah Thorne. Miller's voice was not a whisper, but a clear, resonant declaration of a man reclaiming his honor. "You are under arrest for the murder of Michael Vance." A collective gasp swept the room. Before Thorne could even process the betrayal, another voice rose up. It was Clara. "It's true," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "What the ledger says is true. He threatened to ruin my family." Then the blacksmith Abel Potter, his voice a roar of righteous anger. "He stole my father's smithy." Then another voice, and another, and another. An avalanche of truth finally set loose, a chorus of the oppressed rising up to drown out the tyrant's stunned silence. Thorne looked out at the sea of faces, no longer his subjects, but his accusers, and saw that his power, a thing built entirely on their fear, had just vanished into thin air. Justice in Havenwood was not a thunderclap, but a quiet, steady dawn. After Thorne was led away in irons by federal marshals, a strange calm settled over the town. It was the silence of a fever breaking, the stillness of a forest after a storm. For a few days the people moved through their routines in a daze, blinking in a new light, uncertain of what came next. Then Silas Blackwood, the man who had come to town with no intention of staying, picked up a hammer. He walked to the plot of public land, the one he had won back for them, and struck the first nail into the first board of what would become the town library. The sound was sharp and clear in the morning air, a declaration that the time for tearing down was over. Now was the time to build. One by one, they joined him. First the blacksmith, Abel Potter, his own hammer swinging in a powerful, joyous rhythm. Then the storekeeper. Then loggers who had only ever known how to take trees down, now learning to put a building up. The women of the town, led by a quiet and resolute Clara, organized the effort, bringing food, water, and stacks of donated books they had kept hidden in their attics for years. The construction of the library became the reconstruction of Havenwood itself. It was a barn-raising for the town's soul. Through the long, hopeful weeks of late summer and early autumn, Silas was no longer a stranger. He was the quiet center of the storm of activity, his immense strength and steady presence a foundation upon which they all built. He worked with a purpose that healed the old wounds inside him, the ghosts of his past, finally silenced by the cheerful sounds of saws and hammers. Ellie, her belly now round and full with the promise of new life, directed the work, her vision taking shape board by board. She and Clara often worked together, sorting books, their shared silence a testament to a forgiveness that needed no words. And the law was no longer a thing to be feared. Sheriff Miller, the stoop gone from his shoulders, wore his new badge with a quiet dignity that earned him the town's respect. They had nearly finished. The roof was on, the windows were glazed, and the shelves were being installed. Ellie stood inside, her hand resting on the smooth pine of a shelf, a contented smile on her face. The late autumn sun streamed through the new windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden spirits. Suddenly, her smile vanished. She gasped, her hand flying from the shelf to her swollen belly as a sharp, undeniable pain seized her. She swayed on her feet, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the shelf for support. The men, who had been laughing and joking a moment before, fell silent. Their work forgotten, they rushed to her side, their rough faces etched not with pity, but with a fierce, protective concern. The town that had once cast her out into the cold now gathered around her, ready to carry her into the warmth. 1 year later, the building that had once been a hollowed-out shell of a warehouse was now the heart of Havenwood. Sunlight, no longer defeated by grimy windows, streamed into the Eleanor Vance library, illuminating the rich grain of the pine floors and the bright spines of 1,000 books. The room was filled with the warm, rustling sound of turning pages and the happy, murmuring whispers of children. At the center of it all sat Ellie, a book open on her lap. Leaning against her knee, her dark curls a mirror of her father's, was a little girl with bright, curious eyes named Hope. Ellie was no longer a widow in a town of strangers. She was the keeper of her community's stories and the creator of her own. The front door opened, and a familiar giant frame filled the doorway, casting a gentle shadow. Silas entered, but he was not the same man who had drifted into town a year ago. The grim, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet contentment, the hard lines around his mouth softened by a frequent, easy smile. He walked over to Ellie, his boots making a soft, familiar sound on the floorboards, and effortlessly scooped their daughter up into his arms. The sight of the huge, rugged man holding the small child with such practiced tenderness was a testament to a life rebuilt, a man redeemed. Sheriff Miller followed him in, his badge gleaming on his chest. He wasn't there on official business, he was there as a friend. He stopped before Silas, a look of deep, abiding respect on his face. "The town council asked me to give you this," he said, opening his palm to reveal a simple, six-pointed star, an honorary deputy's badge. "They figured it was time you wore one on the right side of the law again." Silas looked at the star, then at Ellie, whose eyes were shining with tears of joy. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He took the star and pinned it to his shirt. It was not the heavy badge of his past, but a light, shining symbol of his future. He put one arm around Ellie, his other hand holding their daughter securely. They stood together, a family forged in fire and faith, the living heart of a town reborn. As the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the room, the light caught the bronze dedication plaque mounted on the main wall. Its inscription was a covenant, a promise kept. It read, "In memory of Michael Vance, built by the hands of Havenwood, where every story deserves to be heard. For in the quiet strength of a former ranger, the unwavering courage of a librarian, and the bright, hopeful eyes of a child, the story of Havenwood was not over. It was just beginning. And so, the story of Havenwood finds its new beginning, a testament to the courage that can grow in the hardest of places. We read every single one of your comments, and they truly mean the world to us. To keep it simple, if you believe that true justice was finally served in Havenwood, just type the number 1 down below. It's a quick way to show your support and let us know this story resonated with you. Stories of honor, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit are why we're here. If you don't want to miss what's coming next, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We have a story saved for tomorrow that I promise you won't want to miss. Thank you for listening.